Hello, my name is Arlindo Chagas. Welcome to the channel O Nobre dos Contos de Terror. Get ready for a spine-chilling journey, as today I bring you a macabre horror story. If you like scary stories, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any terrifying content. Let's begin. The House on the Hill. In the small village of San Juan, there was a house at the top of a hill that everyone avoided. It was an old building with broken windows and walls covered in ivy. The villagers said the house was cursed, haunted by vengeful spirits that could not find rest. At night, inexplicable sounds echoed through the village, screams, whispers, and eerie laughter. No one knew for sure what happened inside, but everyone had stories to tell. One rainy weekend, a group of 5 teenagers decided it was time to uncover the truth. Mariana, João, Lucas, Ana, and Pedro were inseparable friends, always seeking adventure. Armed with flashlights and courage, they began climbing the hill under the dark sky, ignoring the warnings of the elders. They reached the house just before midnight. The wooden door creaked as Pedro pushed it open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. Their flashlights illuminated the furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was heavy, with a smell of mold and something else. Something that smelled like rotten flesh. "Let's split up and look for clues," João suggested, trying to sound brave. Mariana and Lucas went upstairs, where the stairs groaned under their feet, while João, Ana, and Pedro explored the ground floor. Mariana felt a shiver down her spine every time she passed a mirror, as if she were being watched. Upstairs, they found a room with an old canopy bed and a large painting on the wall. The figure in the portrait seemed to follow them with its eyes. Suddenly, they heard a scream from below. They ran downstairs and found Ana trembling, pointing towards the kitchen. I saw someone in there," she stuttered. The friends entered the kitchen together. Pedro's flashlight revealed a trail of blood leading to the basement door. Fear was etched on all their faces, but curiosity drove them to continue. They descended the basement stairs, each step echoing in the darkness. The basement was even more terrifying. There were unlit candles scattered on the floor, forming a circle around a macabre altar. On top of the altar was a porcelain doll with glassy eyes that seemed to be watching them. Suddenly, the candles lit up on their own, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Let's get out of here," shouted Lucas, but the basement door slammed shut with a bang, trapping them inside. Their flashlights began to flicker, leaving them briefly in total darkness. The fear was palpable, each of them feeling the presence of something evil. Then they heard a whisper, a low, dragging voice that seemed to come from all directions. "You shouldn't be here." The porcelain doll slowly turned its head, its eyes fixed on Pedro. He backed away, tripping and falling to the ground. Mariana tried to open the door, but it was locked. "Help me!" she cried, desperate. João and Lucas ran to help her, but the door wouldn't budge. Ana fell to her knees, crying and praying. Suddenly the doll began to move. Its arms and legs bent grotesquely as it crawled across the floor toward Pedro. He tried to get up, but seemed paralyzed with fear. "Get out of here!" shouted a guttural voice, filling the basement with a sense of despair. Mariana finally managed to open the door with a loud bang, and they all ran up the stairs, leaving Pedro behind. They could hear his screams of terror echoing behind them, but they didn't dare look back. When they finally exited the house, the door slammed shut with a final thud. Panting and panicked, the 4 friends looked back, expecting to see Pedro running after them, but he never came out. Silence enveloped the hill, except for the sound of the rain starting to fall again. From that night on, Pedro was never seen again. His friends reported the incident to the police, but no one believed their story. The house on the hill was sealed off, but the villagers still heard screams at night, and Pedro's figure was seen wandering the hill on rainy nights, his eyes reflecting the eternal terror he experienced in that cursed basement. The Forest of the Lost. In the remote village of São João, there was a dense, dark forest known as the Forest of the Lost. For generations, villagers told tales of people who had entered the forest and never returned. The forest was said to be haunted by vengeful spirits, seeking to trap any who dared to trespass. Whispers of these lost souls carried through the village, warning others to stay away. One summer evening, a seasoned hunter named Ricardo decided to challenge the legend. Ricardo was known for his bravery and skill, and he scoffed at the stories of haunted woods. With his trusted dog Rex by his side, he set off at dusk, determined to prove that the forest held no supernatural secrets. As they entered the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence settled over the area, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Rex, usually fearless, began to whimper and stayed close to Ricardo's side. Hours passed, and the deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Ricardo noticed strange carvings on the trees, symbols that looked ancient and menacing. He tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, focusing on the path ahead. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine as he heard soft, almost imperceptible whispers. He turned around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. Rex started barking furiously at something Ricardo couldn't see. The whispers grew louder, turning into mocking laughter. Ricardo pressed on, but soon he realized they were walking in circles. Every tree, every rock seemed eerily familiar. Panic began to set in as he tried to find a way out. The forest seemed alive, shifting and changing, trapping them in a maze. In the distance, Ricardo saw a faint light flickering through the trees. Desperate for an exit, he followed the light, hoping it would lead them out of the forest. As they approached, the light revealed a clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin in the center. The cabin's windows glowed with an unnatural, ghostly light. Against his better judgment, Ricardo decided to investigate. He pushed open the creaking door, and the smell of decay hit him. The interior was dark and cold, with rotting furniture and cobwebs everywhere. In the corner, he saw a figure hunched over, whispering incoherently. "Hello?" Ricardo called out, but the figure did not respond. As he stepped closer, the figure turned, revealing a gaunt, hollow-eyed face. It was a woman, her eyes filled with despair and madness. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't let you leave." Before Ricardo could react, the door slammed shut behind him, and the temperature dropped even further. Shadows moved along the walls, and the whispering voices returned, louder and more insistent. Rex growled, but even he seemed terrified. The woman pointed to a trap door in the floor. "Below," she said, her voice trembling. "They're below." Ricardo hesitated, but his curiosity got the better of him. He opened the trap door and descended into the darkness, Rex following reluctantly. The basement was a large, cavernous space, lit by flickering torches. Strange symbols were painted on the walls, and in the center of the room was a stone altar. On the altar lay an old, dusty book. Ricardo felt drawn to it, despite the sense of foreboding. As he opened the book, the whispering voices intensified, filling his mind with chaotic thoughts. The words on the pages were in a language he couldn't understand, but as he read, the shadows around him began to take shape, forming twisted, ghastly figures. The spirits of the lost had awakened. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to tremble, and the shadows lunged at him. Ricardo tried to run, but the spirits were relentless, pulling him back toward the altar. Rex barked and snapped at the apparitions, but it was no use. Ricardo felt cold hands gripping him, dragging him down. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was the woman from the cabin, standing at the top of the stairs, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered as the trapdoor closed, sealing Ricardo and Rex inside the cursed basement. Days later, the villagers formed a search party, but they found no trace of Ricardo or Rex. The forest remained silent, its secrets hidden deep within the shadows. Some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear Rex's barking and Ricardo's desperate pleas for help echoing through the trees. The Forest of the Lost had claimed another victim. The abandoned asylum. In the outskirts of Saint-Jouin, there stood an abandoned asylum, a place shrouded in mystery and dread. The locals whispered about the horrific experiments and tortures that took place there, and many believed the spirits of the tortured patients still haunted the halls. The asylum had been closed for decades, left to decay and be reclaimed by nature, but its sinister reputation kept everyone away. One chilly autumn evening, a group of friends decided to explore the asylum. Maria, Eduardo, Julia, and Roberto were thrill-seekers, always looking for the next big adventure. They had heard the stories, but dismissed them as mere superstition. With flashlights and cameras in hand, they approached the looming structure under the cover of darkness. The gate, rusty and overgrown with ivy, creaked open with a loud groan. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The friends walked cautiously up the cracked pathway, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The main door of the asylum hung ajar, inviting them into the darkness within. "Let's stick together," Eduardo suggested, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. The entrance hall was vast, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered about. Their flashlights cast long shadows on the walls, making the place seem even more sinister. As they ventured further, they found themselves in a long corridor lined with patient rooms. Each door had a small barred window, and the walls were covered in scratch marks and cryptic messages. "Look at this," Julia whispered, pointing to a message scrawled in red. "Help us." A chill ran down Maria's spine. "Maybe we should leave," she suggested, but the others were determined to continue. They reached a room at the end of the corridor, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was filled with old medical equipment, rusty gurneys, broken syringes, and tattered restraints. On the far wall, there was a large mirror, cracked and dusty. As they entered, the temperature dropped noticeably, and their breath became visible in the cold air. Eduardo aimed his flashlight at the mirror, and for a moment, they all saw a shadowy figure standing behind them. They turned around quickly, but the room was empty. "Did you see that?" Roberto asked, his voice shaking. "Let's keep moving," Maria urged, her fear growing. They continued exploring, finding themselves in the old operating theatre. The room was circular, with rows of seats overlooking a central operating table. The table was stained with old dried blood, and the overhead light swung slightly, creaking with each movement. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Their flashlights began to flicker too, and the air filled with a low, haunting moan. The friends huddled together, fear gripping their hearts. In the dim light, they saw shadowy figures moving in the periphery, circling them. "Let's get out of here!" Julia screamed, and they bolted for the exit. As they ran through the labyrinthine corridors, the sounds of footsteps and whispers followed them. The walls seemed to close in, the hallways stretching endlessly. They stumbled upon a staircase leading to the basement. Desperate to find another way out, They descended into the depths of the asylum. The basement was even more horrifying. It was a series of narrow, damp tunnels lined with cells. The cells were tiny, each containing a single rusty bed frame and shackles. As they moved through the tunnels, they heard the clinking of chains and faint cries for help. In one of the cells, they saw a ghostly figure, a man in a hospital gown, his eyes hollow and lifeless. He reached out towards them, his chains rattling. "Help me," he whispered, his voice echoing in the narrow space. The friends backed away in terror, but the figure began to move through the bars, stretching unnaturally. "Run!" Eduardo shouted, and they sprinted through the tunnels, the ghostly wails growing louder. They finally found a staircase leading back to the main floor. As they climbed, the air grew warmer, but the sense of dread did not dissipate. They burst through a door into the main hall, gasping for breath. The entrance was just ahead, and they ran towards it, desperate to escape. But as they reached the door, it slammed shut in their faces. The windows shattered, and a cold wind swept through the hall, carrying with it the screams of the lost souls. The friends huddled together, their flashlights dying one by one. The shadows in the room grew thicker, and the ghostly figures of the patients and staff began to emerge, their faces twisted in pain and anger. The friends were surrounded, the spirits closing in on them. In a final desperate attempt, Maria shouted, "We mean no harm! Please let us go!" The spirits paused, their expressions shifting from anger to sorrow. Slowly, the figures began to fade, the temperature rising back to normal. The door creaked open, and the friends wasted no time in running outside, never looking back. They never spoke of that night again, but the experience haunted them for the rest of their lives. The asylum remained abandoned, its secrets buried deep within its walls. But the villagers knew better than to venture near, for the spirits of the tortured still lingered, waiting for the next intruder. The haunting of Old Mill Road, in the heart of Saint Juan. There was an old, abandoned house on Mill Road. The house had been empty for decades, its once grand facade now crumbling and covered in ivy. The locals spoke of the house in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted by the spirits of a family that had vanished without a trace many years ago. Strange lights were seen in the windows at night, and eerie noises echoed from within its walls. One cold winter evening, a young couple, Ana and Carlos, decided to explore the house. They were new to the village and had heard the stories, but didn't believe in ghosts. They thought it would be a fun adventure, a chance to debunk the local myths. With a lantern and a sense of excitement, they approached the house just as the sun was setting. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking as they pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark and cold, with an overpowering smell of mildew. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped inside, their lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "Let's check upstairs," Carlos suggested, trying to sound brave. They climbed the grand staircase, which was covered in dust and cobwebs. The upstairs hallway was lined with closed doors, each one seeming to hold its own secrets. As they walked down the hall, they heard a faint whisper, almost too quiet to be real. "Did you hear that?" Ana asked, her voice trembling. Carlos nodded, but he didn't want to show his fear. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though he didn't believe it himself. They entered one of the bedrooms, finding old, decaying furniture and a large, dusty mirror on the wall. The mirror's surface was cracked, distorting their reflections. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and their breath became visible in the cold air. "Let's get out of here," Ana said, her fear growing. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They tried to open it, but it was locked from the outside. Panic set in as they pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one could hear them. The whispering grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The mirror began to glow with a strange, otherworldly light. In its cracked surface, they saw the reflection of a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, standing behind them. The family's faces were twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and dark. "Who are you?" Carlos demanded, his voice shaking. The mother stepped forward, her ghostly figure barely visible. "We are the Rodriguez family," she said, her voice echoing in the cold air. "We were trapped here, and now you are too." Ana and Carlos backed away, their fear turning into sheer terror. "What do you want from us?" Ana cried. "We want peace," the father said, his voice deep and mournful. "But we cannot leave until our story is told." The room began to shake, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The ghostly family moved closer, their hands outstretched. Ana and Carlos felt a freezing cold grip on their arms, pulling them towards the mirror. "You must tell our story," the children whispered, their voices overlapping. "Tell the world what happened to us." Desperate to escape, Ana shouted, "We will! We promise!" The room fell silent, the cold grip releasing them. The door creaked open slowly, and they ran out of the house, not daring to look back. Outside, they could still hear the faint whispers, urging them to share the story. Shaken and breathless, Ana and Carlos returned to the village. They told the villagers what they had experienced, sharing the tragic tale of the Rodriguez family. According to the old records, the family had mysteriously disappeared one night, leaving no trace. The house had been abandoned ever since. The villagers listened, their faces pale with fear. Some believed the story, while others remained skeptical. But Ana and Carlos knew the truth. They had seen the ghosts, felt their cold touch, and heard their desperate plea. From that night on, the house on Mill Road was left undisturbed. The villagers avoided it, knowing that the spirits of the Rodriguez family were still trapped inside, waiting for the day they could finally find peace. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear their whispers echoing through the empty halls. The Whispering Woods. In a small village nestled at the edge of a dense, ancient forest, there were tales of the Whispering Woods. The villagers spoke of strange sounds that echoed through the trees at night, whispers that seemed to call out to anyone who dared to listen. The forest was said to be cursed, home to restless spirits and dark, malevolent forces. No one ventured into the woods after dark, for those who did were never seen again. One chilly autumn evening, a group of friends, Lucas, Isabel, Pedro, and Clara, decided to test their courage and explore the Whispering Woods. They were skeptical of the old stories and wanted to prove that there was nothing to fear. With flashlights and a map, they set off just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The entrance to the forest was marked by a twisted, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As they stepped into the woods, a hush fell over the group. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped them. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Stay close together," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. They walked deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and the path harder to follow. Strange symbols were carved into the trunks, and the air was filled with the faint scent of decay. As they ventured further, the whispers began, soft, almost indistinguishable at first, but growing louder with each step. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her eyes wide with fear. "It's just the wind," Pedro replied, though he didn't sound convinced. The whispers grew louder, now clearly voices speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The friends huddled together, their flashlights flickering as the air grew colder still. Shadows danced among the trees, and the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. "We should turn back," Isabel suggested, her voice trembling. But Lucas, determined to prove their bravery, insisted they continue. They pressed on until they came to a clearing, dominated by a large moss-covered stone altar. The ground around it was littered with animal bones and remnants of old tattered clothes. "This must be where the rituals took place," Lucas said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. As they examined the altar, the whispers turned into wails, anguished cries that filled the air with a sense of dread. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, unnatural fog began to creep in, obscuring their vision. "Something's not right," Pedro said, backing away from the altar. Suddenly, the fog parted, revealing a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging in matted strands around her face. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression one of deep sorrow. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice echoing through the clearing. "Leave before it's too late." The friends were frozen in fear, unable to move or speak. The woman began to move towards them, her steps slow and deliberate. As she approached, the wails grew louder, filling their ears with a cacophony of despair. "Run!" Lucas finally shouted, breaking the spell. They turned and fled, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. The whispers and wails followed them, the fog closing in from all sides. The trees seemed to reach out, their branches clawing at their clothes and skin. The path they had followed was gone, replaced by a maze of twisted roots and fallen leaves. "Keep going!" Isabel urged, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They stumbled through the darkness, the whispers now screaming in their ears. Shapes moved in the fog, shadowy figures that seemed to watch their every move. Just when they thought they were lost, they burst out of the forest, collapsing onto the ground in relief. They lay there, gasping for breath, the whispers fading into the distance. The village was just ahead, the safety of their homes a beacon in the night. They swore never to speak of what they had seen, the terror of the whispering woods etched into their minds forever. From that night on, no one dared to enter the forest again. The villagers knew that the whispers were real, a warning to stay away. And on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the voices calling out, a reminder of the dark secrets hidden within the whispering woods. The Cursed Lantern. In the quiet village of Saint-Jouan, there was a legend about a cursed lantern that brought doom to anyone who found it. The story had been passed down through generations, warning children and adults alike to stay away from the old, abandoned well where the lantern was last seen. According to the legend, a peddler had brought the lantern to the village many years ago, claiming it could light up the darkest nights. But it soon became clear that the lantern held a dark, sinister power. One foggy evening, a curious young man named Raphael decided to test the legend. He was a skeptic and wanted to prove that the stories were just old superstitions. Armed with nothing but his flashlight and a sense of adventure, he set off towards the abandoned well, located deep in the forest on the outskirts of the village. The path to the well was overgrown and rarely traveled. As Raphael made his way through the thick underbrush, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches forming a dark canopy that blocked out the remaining light. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over the forest. After what felt like hours, Raphael finally reached the well. It was a crumbling stone structure covered in moss and ivy. He shone his flashlight down into the darkness, but the beam couldn't reach the bottom. Taking a deep breath, he climbed over the edge and began his descent, using an old frayed rope that hung from a rusty pulley. As he reached the bottom, his flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled in his bag for a spare battery, but before he could replace it, he noticed a faint glow coming from a corner of the well. There, partially buried in the dirt, was the cursed lantern. Curiosity got the better of him, and Raphael reached out to pick it up. As soon as his fingers touched the cold metal, the lantern sprang to life, casting an eerie green light that filled the well. He felt a shiver run down his spine, but he was determined to see this through. Clutching the lantern, he began his climb back to the surface. As he emerged from the well, the forest seemed to come alive with whispers. The trees creaked and groaned, and shadows danced in the green light of the lantern. Raphael felt a growing sense of dread, but pushed it aside, telling himself it was just his imagination. He started the journey back to the village, but the path seemed to have changed. The trees were closer together, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to grab him. The whispers grew louder, forming words that he couldn't quite understand. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly a figure appeared in front of him, a woman in tattered clothing, her eyes glowing with the same eerie green light as the lantern. "You should not have taken it," she whispered, her voice a chilling hiss. Raphael stumbled back, fear gripping him. "Who are you?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. "I am the curse that binds this lantern," she said, stepping closer. "It was never meant to leave the well." He turned and ran, but the forest seemed to conspire against him. The path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the darkness. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more insistent. He could feel the presence of unseen figures all around him, closing in. In his panic, Raphael tripped over a root and fell, the lantern slipping from his grasp. As it hit the ground, the green light intensified, and the whispers turned into screams. He scrambled to his feet, but the woman was already there, her eyes burning with fury. "You cannot escape," she said, her voice echoing through the trees. "You are now part of the curse." Desperate, Raphael grabbed the lantern and hurled it into the darkness. The light flickered and died, plunging the forest into an impenetrable blackness. The screams faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. He lay there, trembling, too afraid to move. Hours passed before he dared to stand. The forest was still, and the path to the village was clear once more. He made his way back, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the curse was real. He told no one of his encounter, but the haunted look in his eyes spoke volumes. From that night on, Raphael was never the same. He avoided the forest and the old well, warning others to do the same. The lantern was never found again, but its legend lived on, a dark reminder of the cursed light that brought nothing but terror. The haunting of Blackwood Manor. In the outskirts of a sleepy village stood Blackwood Manor, a grand but decaying mansion that had been abandoned for decades. The villagers avoided it, whispering tales of ghostly apparitions and unexplained disappearances. The manor was said to be cursed, its walls echoing with the cries of those who had vanished within. One cold, stormy night, a group of thrill-seeking friends, Emily, Jack, Sarah and Tom, decided to explore Blackwood Manor. They were drawn by the mystery and the promise of an adrenaline rush. Armed with flashlights, cameras and a Ouija board, they set off towards the mansion, their excitement masking the fear that gnawed at the edges of their minds. The manor loomed before them, its once grand facade now crumbling and covered in ivy. The windows were dark, like empty eye sockets, and the air around it felt heavy with a foreboding presence. As they pushed open the creaking front door, a chill ran down their spines. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," Jack replied, trying to sound brave. "Let's see if the stories are true." They stepped into the grand foyer, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air inside was cold and musty, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Dust motes danced in the beams of their lights, adding to the sense of unreality. "Let's split up and explore," Emily suggested, though she felt a pang of unease at the thought. They agreed and paired off, Emily with Jack and Sarah with Tom. Emily and Jack made their way upstairs, the wooden steps groaning under their weight. The upper floor was even darker, the shadows deeper and more menacing. As they explored the long, winding corridors, they felt the oppressive silence pressing in on them. Meanwhile, Sarah and Tom ventured into the basement. The air grew colder and damper as they descended, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The basement was filled with old furniture covered in dust sheets, and the walls were lined with shelves of forgotten belongings. A strange metallic smell hung in the air. "Let's set up the Ouija board here," Tom suggested, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Sarah nodded, though she felt a deep sense of dread. They placed the board on an old table and sat opposite each other, their flashlights casting long shadows. As they placed their fingers on the planchette, the air grew even colder, and a faint whispering sound began to fill the room. "Is there anyone here with us?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move, spelling out a single word: "Leave." Upstairs, Emily and Jack heard the faint whispering and felt an icy breeze brush past them. They exchanged nervous glances and decided to head back downstairs. As they reached the top of the staircase, they saw a figure standing at the bottom, a woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, clutching Jack's arm. "Yeah, let's get out of here," Jack replied, his voice barely audible. They hurried down the stairs, but the figure vanished before they reached the bottom. They found Sarah and Tom in the basement, pale and trembling. "We need to leave," Tom said urgently. "Now." They didn't argue. As they made their way back to the foyer, the whispering grew louder, filling the air with a cacophony of voices. The shadows seemed to move, reaching out to them. They could feel a malevolent presence closing in. "Run!" Jack shouted, and they bolted for the door. They burst out into the stormy night, the rain pouring down in sheets. As they ran, they glanced back and saw the woman in the tattered dress standing in the doorway, watching them with hollow eyes. Her figure faded into the darkness as they fled down the path, not stopping until they were back in the safety of the village. They never spoke of what happened that night, but the memory haunted them. They knew they had come too close to the darkness that dwelled within Blackwood Manor. The whispers and the sorrowful eyes of the ghostly woman stayed with them, a chilling reminder of the night they ventured into the haunted mansion and barely escaped with their lives. I hope you enjoyed this terrifying story. If you want more spine-chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share it with your friends. Until next time, and beware of what lurks in the shadows.